By the 1920s, the idea of citizenship, both as a kind of national discourse but also a political signifier within the countries of Britain and USA, was quite widespread. Changes in the franchise, also in the ways in which people were living in the urban environment and associating with each other, meant that this discourse had really permeated every level of political culture. I try and approach the idea of citizenship as a much more local understanding, not so much to do with the rights that one might get as a citizen, but to do with the ways in which citizenship was meant to be the way you lived in the urban environment. I come from an urban history background, something which I've been undertaking since I was an undergraduate. So very much I think about the ideas of these kind of things through the prism of the city. So not so much just how this person lives or the citizen lives in the city, but also in the ways that the city informs that kind of narrative. Clearly in the Victorian period especially, there is a clear definition of what it means to be civically minded. This is quite a restricted idea, though, much to kind of upper class or upper middle class white and mostly male as well. In 1918 and then again in 1928 you get an extension to the franchise, so women become part of this notion of citizenship as well. By the 1920s, the idea of citizenship was an ideology that permeated almost every level of political culture in both the United States and in Britain. Obviously, as an idea, citizenship can be traced right back into the 19th century and beyond. The idea of what it meant to be a citizen, the idea of rights and responsibilities. Clearly, this idea is very much a legal signifier. What could the citizen deserve from government? What did the government expect from the citizen? Obviously, very much located around the idea of suffrage and voting, and also in the 19th century, the idea of the civic dignitary as well. By the 1920s, historians have seen this as being a very much national idea, based on national culture and also participation in national politics. In Britain, for example, citizenship becomes located very much around the idea of cultural institutions like the BBC, which, whilst having regional stations, is very much emanating from a central, nationalised level, but also in national days of remembrance like Armistice. In America, you see something of the same kind of thing. During World War I, while the national government didn't expand on the same level that it did in Britain, it certainly started to increase its purview in terms of policy, but also the ways in which it dealt with the wider country. Also, in America, you get increased calls for what is termed 100% Americanism. In a sense, this is very much a exclusionary idea of citizenship, based very much on racial characteristics, but also an almost blindingly loyal patriotism as well. These two cities then form the basis of my PhD research. I've split the topic into three different parts. Firstly, very much concentrating on the idea of the city. This is formed through representations in certain types of educational textbooks, what we might call civics textbooks, but also in things like public festivals as well. Through these devices, the city becomes very important in terms of forming citizens. What is important about the city? How is this shown to the citizen? And how does this encapsulate a new way of thinking about the relationship between the individual and the state? In the second part of the thesis, I move on to look at the ways in which this leaves the purview of the government and is very much located in associational culture. So I look at various civic societies, citizens' clubs, but also lower level movements like boys' clubs and the Scouts or the Girl Guides as well. The third part of the thesis moves back towards government, but looks at the new ways in which government becomes involved in the life of the citizen. This very much takes place in ideas of welfare, as seen in the extensive movement of elementary schools, which happened just before the interwar period, but really came to fruition during those years, and also new forms of welfare, like public housing as well. When these three strands are taken together, you get a much clearer idea about how government, but also civil society, attempts to make citizens. You can discover what the actual key characteristics of being a citizen actually means in this period. As I mentioned before, historians have seen this mostly from a political angle, thinking in terms of voting and suffrage or holding office. But at this point, citizenship is a theory that tries to encapsulate or incorporate the whole of the nation. So I'm much more interested in the idea of citizenship as being a behavioural type of identity. In this period, we could see this very much related to the idea of the body and also to do with health. Emerging at the beginning of the 20th century, there's quite a widespread concern with the idea of national efficiency and how the urban environment in particular is leading to degeneration. Whilst this does go off into eugenics movements, it also goes into public health movements more generally, and also the idea that everyone has an unrealised capacity to be a better citizen. I became interested in the idea of citizenship whilst I was an undergraduate, also at the University of Leicester, undertaking a BA in history. My dissertation focused on public housing in a small northern town, and very much in the ways in which an idea of this town informed the particular policies of welfare. After my BA in history at the University of Leicester, I went on to do a Masters in urban history, and I also left the idea of the small town and welfare and moved much more towards large cities, industrial cities specifically, in the 20th century. I concentrate my research on Chicago in the US and Manchester in the UK. The reason I'm interested in Manchester and Chicago is because they occupy a quite important part of culture in the 1920s, both of them being arguably the second city of the nation in terms of business and industry, but also having a very distinct idea of civic pride. In Manchester, this is based very much around a certain type of Victorian liberalism, but going into a new modern environment in the 1920s. This is seen in things like the Town Hall extension in the late 30s, and also a Civic airport, which was built in the 20s and expanded into what is now known as Ringway. In Chicago, this is also seen in the grand ideas associated with the Chicago Plan, which is first articulated in the early part of the 20th century, but actually starts to see some piecemeal efforts in the 1920s. I've been interested in this research to try and take the way in which I look at citizenship away from the classic narrative of government and politicians or civic elites, and try and get much more down to a day-to-day level. By looking at housing and schools in particular, this becomes a much more simple task. In a sense, these were very physical and new types of space, based very much on an egalitarian way of living, which was hoped would form and make new citizens. In a sense, this approach tries to make us think more about the material world in which we live in, and this is really a way in which I see my thesis being very much of urban history, looking at the material technologies of the school in terms of heating or ventilation, or even particular types of materials that the actual environment is constructed out of. Linoleum, for example, a new type of flooring material in the 19th century, becomes very important for its characteristics in the school environment. While this might seem quite esoteric in a sense, it very much becomes tied up in a discourse surrounding the idea of how the citizen can get the most from the environment in which he or she works and lives. An example of this very much interwar type of citizenship and civic pride can be seen in two civic festivals that I look at. In Chicago in 1921, what is called the Pageant of Progress, a 2-week event taking place on the Municipal Pier and also some of the surrounding streets. I compare this with Civic Week in Manchester, which took place in 1926. By looking at these two festivals, we can very much see a way in which the citizen is formed against the background of the urban environment. In a sense, these type of festivals are nothing new. They go back into the medieval period, and also during the 19th century you get very particular types of urban pageant and parade. I'd argue, though, that in the 1920s these become slightly different. They're based much more on incorporating the whole of the citizenship of the city, but also a way of showing government in terms of its functions and machinery. For example, in 19th century parades, you might see the mayor in all of his civic regalia parading alongside other members of the town council. In the events I look at, though, as well as this civic regalia, there are also examples of the town's cleaners parading along the streets, or also the policemen of the town as well. In a way, then, these festivals try and transmit an idea of urban government to the citizen. Again, this comes back to the ways that I'm trying to take citizenship away from being just a national identity, but also a very local one, formed around the idea of the relationship between the individual and the local state. As I finish the thesis, I'm hoping it will achieve two main things. Firstly, to reposition citizenship in the interwar period as a local as well as a national identity. The second thing I'd like to achieve is that citizenship, in a sense, is a form of behaviour and not just a legal signifier. No, I'm trying to think of something interesting to say. I can't think of anything. I just drank and ate when I was there.
Keep it running. Say exactly the same thing with a smile in your voice.
Smile in my voice.